10th chapter of the second canto, the 10th and final chapter. After the Lord Krishna himself spoke the Chatursloki Bhagavatam to Lord Brahma, the Srimad Bhagavatam with all its esoteric truths in 4 verses, he spoke that to Lord Brahma. And then the Lord disappeared, and later Lord Brahma spoke these same truths. We were actually hearing how Brahma spoke this to Narada Muni. And then Narada Muni received the request from Srila Vyasadeva to expand this. To expand this. This was his order. And then Narada Muni, by his mercy, told this to Srila Vyasadeva, who presented the Srimad Bhagavatam after realizing it fully in the trance of Samadhi meditation that we heard about in chapter 7 of the first canto. So, in the last chapter, at the end of the last chapter, there was one verse that described the Srimad Bhagavatam, which was described by the personality of Godhead in 4 verses, and which contains 10 characteristics, was told with satisfaction by the Father to his son Narada. So there are 10 characteristics, or 10 aspects of the Srimad Bhagavatam, 10 topics of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And those 10 topics will be now described for a specific purpose. So the first and second verses of this 10th chapter are very important, and they describe the 10 topics of the Bhagavatam. Shri Sukadeva Atra Saga Vishagascha Stanam Poshanamutaya Manvatara Ichanurka Kata Nirodha Muktirasraya Dasamasya Vashujartam Navanami Alakshanam Varnayanti Mahatmana Shutanartena Chanjusa. So here's the meaning. Sukadeva Gosvami said, Srila Sukadeva Goswami said, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, there are 10 divisions of statements regarding the following. There are 10 divisions of statements regarding the following. The creation of the universe, that's Sarga. Then the subcreation, or the secondary creation, that's Visarga. This is the content of the Srimad Bhagavatam. This is the content that allows it to be considered a Mahapurana, a specific type of literature. This is one of the characteristics of a Mahapurana, that it has to contain topics, these 10 subject matters. So Sarga Visarga, the primary creation, and we'll discuss what each one of those are, and Sukadeva himself will discuss that as well. Sarga Visarga, the secondary creation, the creation by Lord Brahma. Sarga Visarga Stanam. Stanam means sthiti, or the creation, the material creation of the planetary systems. And then Poshanam means protection by the Lord. Uttaya, the creative impetus, means the living entities, every one of them has this desire within them to create, to do something, to act within the material world, to gain something in the material world. So what is being created? One thing that is being created is our karma by our activities. That's the main thing that we create by this uttaya. And by this karma, the material world, basically speaking, is maintained. Aparayam idatpanam prakritim vidime param jiva bhutta mahabaho vedam darite jagat. By the desires, by the karma of the living entity, the material world is maintained. This is the purpose of the material world, to give the living entities a facility to express their uttaya, their desires, their creative tendencies. So that's atra sargasta stanam poshanam uttaya. Then manvantara ishanukata. Manvantara means the different Manus and their families and their vanks, their descendants. The Manus are the executive, they're empowered executive rulers of the world. And they populate the universe. And Ishanukata means the kata, or the pastimes and activities of the Lord and His devotees when they come to this world as avatars. Isha Anukata. Isha means the controller. Anukata means the pastimes about the controller. Narodha, Mukti, and Asraya. Narodha means the annihilation. There are different types of annihilations of the universe, of the material creation, when everything becomes wound up within the Lord, including the material energy, the living entities, and their karma becomes wound up inside of the Lord. There are 4 different types of annihilations, and these are discussed in the Bhagavatam. And the 9th topic is called Mukti. Mukti means the liberation of the living entity. And finally, the final topic is called Asraya, the shelter of all these other 9 different topics. So Prabhupada translates that here. The summum bonum, or the substratum, or the advaya jnana, or the absolute truth, or the source of the others. That energy, that being, that personality of Krishna, whom those other 9 take shelter of. So Ashraya means the shelter of the other 9. The source and the shelter of all the other energies, all the other topics. That is the Supreme Lord, Sri Bhagavan Sri Krishna. So I'll read the verse. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, there are 10 divisions of statements regarding the following: the creation of the universe, subcreation, planetary systems, protection by the Lord, the creative impetus, the change of Manus, the science of God returning home back to Godhead, liberation, and the summum bonum. And in the second verse, to isolate the transcendence of the summum bonum, the symptoms of the rest are described sometimes by Vedic inference, sometimes by direct explanation, and sometimes by summary explanations given by the great sages. So this verse, the second verse, describes the actual purpose of describing the 9 topics. And the purpose of describing the 9 topics is to illuminate the 10th topic, which is the summum bonum, or the asraya, or the shelter of the other topics. And that shelter, again, that is Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the 9 topics are described specifically so that we are able to understand Krishna, which is the subject matter specifically of the 10th and 11th canto, especially the 10th canto, which tells the pastimes of Krishna. Because if we don't hear and understand clearly these 9 topics, we will not be able to understand properly the 10th topic, or Krishna. We will mistake him for an ordinary person. Unless we understand that the whole universe, the saga, visaga, all the universe, in its primary and secondary creation, unless we understand the entirety of the material creation, stanam or stiti or poshanam, how everyone is being protected by the Lord, utaya, how the living entities are impelled by this desire to create, by the potency of the Lord. Unless we understand the Manus and their instructions and the avatars and Naroda, the annihilations, how everything gets wound up within the Supreme Person, unless we understand the different categories of mukti or liberation of the soul from bondage, from the material entrapments, unless we understand these things, we will not be able to understand Krishna. Unless we understand that these things, each one of those 10 topics, which are the subject matter of the Bhagavatam, they all have a relationship with Krishna, and to understand them properly means to understand them in relationship to Krishna. Just like, who am I? I can understand myself as a living entity, or I can understand myself as an American, or a bald-headed fellow, or I could understand myself as a 52-year-old person, or I can understand myself in this way, I can understand myself in that way. But unless I understand myself in relationship to Krishna, I'm not understanding myself completely and accurately. Even if I go to the degree of understanding myself as a soul, an eternal spark of spirit, because I'm not, that definition does not allow me to understand myself in relationship to Krishna. It is still incomplete, and it is not true knowledge of myself. So everything has its relationship to Krishna, and everything, all these topics, have their shelter in Krishna. They all come from Krishna. That is the meaning of the absolute truth. And this is the topic. The absolute truth is Krishna himself is the only topic of the Bhagavatam, actually. And these other topics are explained to shed light on our dark consciousnesses, to shed light upon Krishna. So now, here text 3, where now one by one, actually what I'll do before we read these, now until text 7 I believe, and actually up to text 9, and even beyond, these 10 topics are going to be described in summary by Srila Sukadeva Gosvami. And in Chaitanya Charitamrita in Adi Lila chapter 2, this verse is quoted by Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami Maharaj. These two verses are quoted. Why? To prove in his explanation how Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because this is the purpose of this verse, to show how the 9 topics take shelter on the 10th topic, in the 10th topic. So when Kaviraj Goswami is describing, proving from Shastra that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he quotes this verse. Atra saga vishargascha stanam postanamutaya manvatara ishanakata naroda muktirasraya dasamasya vishuddhartam navanam mihalakshanam vanayanti mahatmana shrutenartena sanjasa. Here in Srimad Bhagavatam, 10 subjects are described. The creation of the ingredients of the cosmos. Which one is that? That is Saga. The creations of Brahma. That is Visarga. The maintenance of the creation. That is Stanam or Stiti. 4. the special favor given to the faithful, that's poshanam. 5, impetus for activities, that is uttaya. 6, prescribed duties for law-abiding men, that's manavataram. 7, description of the incarnations of the Lord, isha anukita. 8, the winding up of the creation, naroda. 9, liberation from gross and subtle material existence, that is mukti. And 10, the ultimate shelter, asraya, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The 10th item, Kaviraj Goswami says, is the shelter to all the others. To distinguish this ultimate shelter from the other 9 items, the Mahajans have described these 9 directly or indirectly through prayers or direct explanations. So that is the subject matter of the Bhagavatam. That's all that exists in the Bhagavatam, is the description of these 10 items. The 9 to give a definition and make us understand the 10th item, the shelter. That's the ashraya. So here's Prabhupada's purport in which he describes them one by one. This verse from the Bhagavatam, 2.10.1 and 2, lists the 10 subject matters dealt with in the text of the Bhagavatam. Of these, the 10th is the substance, and the other 9 are categories derived from the substance. These 10 subjects are listed as follows. Sarga, the first creation by Vishnu. The bringing forth of the 5 gross material elements, the 5 objects of sense perception, the 10 senses, the mind, intelligence, false ego, and the total material energy or universal form, the Mahatattva. So we heard this in the 6th chapter and 5th chapter of the 2nd canto. We heard how the Lord glanced at the material energy, the Mahatattva, and by the potency of that glance, the false ego in 3 different ways, goodness, passion, and ignorance, came forth. And from that, the sense objects, the senses, and the 5 gross material elements were created. So in this way, this is the Saga creation. And everything, all that Saga creation, that primary creation by Krishna, by Maha-Visnu, Ksirodakasayi Visnu, this is existing in a subtle form. Then the Vishaga, the secondary creation, or the work of Brahma in producing the moving and unmoving bodies in the universe. So all that which exists in the universe, the substance of the universe, that is Brahma's creation, and that is called Visaga. Sthana, the maintenance of the universe by the personality of Godhead Vishnu. Vishnu's function is more important and his glory is greater than Brahma's and Lord Shiva's. For although Brahma is the creator of Lord Shiva and Lord Shiva the destroyer, Vishnu is the maintainer. Poshana, special care and protection for devotees by the Lord. As a king maintains his kingdom and subjects, but nevertheless gives special attention to the members of his family, so the personality of Godhead gives special care to his devotees, who are souls completely surrendered to him. So where will we hear about that? What cantos? The Poshanam. 7th canto. 6th canto. Certainly in the 1st canto too, where Pricket Maharaj was saved. Actually, after we finish this, I'll give you a list that Jiva Goswami gives of where everything is located. Uti, the urge for creation or initiative power that is the cause of all inventions, according to the necessity of time, space, and objects. Manvantara, the regulative principles for living beings who desire to achieve perfection in human life. The rules of Manu, as described in the Manu Samhita, guide the way to such perfection. Ishanukata, 7. Scriptural information regarding the personality of Godhead, His incarnations on earth, and the activities of His devotees. Scriptures dealing with these subjects are essential for progressive human life. Nirodha, the winding up of all energies employed in creation. Such potencies are emanations from the personality of Godhead, who eternally lies in the Karana ocean. The cosmic creation, manifested with His breath, are again dissolved in due course. Mukti, 9. Liberation of the conditioned souls encaged by the gross and subtle coverings of the body and the mind. The freedom from the coverings of the body and the mind. When freed from all material affection, the soul, giving up the gross and subtle material bodies, can attain the spiritual sky in his original spiritual body and engage in transcendental loving service to the Lord in Vaikuntha Loka or Krishna Loka. That means that as long as we are encaged in the gross material body and the subtle mind and are attached to the things of both those, we cannot go to Krishna. Liberation is prerequisite for going back to Godhead. We have to be free from matter. Just like before a prisoner can get a job or do something wonderful in the free world, what does he have to do? He has to get out of prison. So before we can do something wonderful, the soul can act wonderfully, we first have to get out of the prison of the material body and mind. And then the 10th is asrai, the transcendence, the summum bonum, from whom everything emanates, upon whom everything rests, in whom everything merges after annihilation. He is the source and support of all. The asrai is called the Supreme Brahman. What is the Sanskrit for Supreme Brahman? Parabrahma. Param Brahma, Param Dhamma, Pavitram. That is Krishna. As in the Vedanta Sutra, Atato Brahma Gigyasa Jamadyasya Yataha, Srimad Bhagavatam especially describes the Supreme Brahman as the Asraya. Sri Krishna is this Asraya, and therefore the greatest necessity of life, the Prayojan, is to study the science of Krishna, because he is our Asraya too. Srimad Bhagavatam accepts Sri Krishna as the shelter of all manifestations, because Lord Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the ultimate source of everything, the supreme goal of all. Two different principles are to be considered herein, namely asraya, the object providing shelter, and asrita, the dependents requiring shelter. Which are we? Are we the shelter of the universe? Are we the shelter of the sun and the moon? Are we the shelter of anything? No. We are the living entity requiring shelter. We're one. We're something requiring shelter. The ashrita exists under the original principle, the ashraya. The first 9 categories described in the first 9 cantos of the Bhagavatam, from creation to liberation, including the purusa-avatars, the incarnations, the marginal energy or living entities, and the external energy of all material world, are all ashrita. The prayers of Srimad Bhagavatam, however, aim for the ashraya tattva, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. The great souls, expert in describing Srimad Bhagavatam, have very diligently delineated the other 9 categories, sometimes by direct narrations and sometimes by indirect narrations, such as stories. So that's the Prabhupada's purport here. He's explaining in the second verse over here that the that these topics are described sometimes by direct explanation, sometimes by summary explanations given by great sages. That's what he's describing here. And sometimes the indirect explanations are stories like that. The real purpose of doing this is to know perfectly the absolute transcendence, Sri Krishna, for the entire creation, both material and spiritual, rests on the body of Sri Krishna. So he is the Ashraya. Kaviraj Goswami continues. To know distinctly the ultimate shelter of everything that be, I have described the other 9 categories. The cause for the appearance of these 9 is rightly called their shelter. The personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, is the shelter and abode of everything. All the universes rest in his body. The 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam reveals the 10th object, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the shelter of the surrendered souls. He is known as Sri Krishna, and he is the ultimate source of all the universes. Let me offer my obeisances unto him. That quotation came from Srila Sridhar Swami's commentary on the first verse of the 10th canto, chapter 1 of Srimad Bhagavatam. So, at a different point in the 12th canto, making the same point, how glorifying the Bhagavatam and showing ultimately how Krishna is the Supreme Lord, Sutta Goswami recites a verse which is very similar to this. Sargo syatya vishargascha vritti rakshantarani cha vangso vangsanucharitam samsta hitura pasraya dasabdir lakshanar yuktam puranam tadvido vidu chaitit pancha vidam brahman maharaupo vyavastaya. O Brahmana, authorities on the matter can understand a Purana to contain 10 characteristic topics. The creation of this universe, the subsequent creation of worlds and beings, the maintenance of all living beings, their sustenance, the rule of various Manus, the dynasties of great kings, the activities of such kings, annihilation, motivation, and the supreme shelter. Other scholars state that the great Puranas, the Mahapuranas, deal with these 10 topics, while lesser Puranas may deal with 5. So, in the commentary on this verse, Srila Jiva Goswami is quoted by saying that these 10 principal topics of Srimad Bhagavatam are found within each of the 12 cantos. One should not try to assign each of the 10 topics to a particular canto. Nor should the Srimad Bhagavatam be artificially interpreted to show that it deals with the topics successively. The simple fact is that all aspects of knowledge important to human beings, summarized in the 10 categories mentioned above, are described with various degrees of emphasis and analysis throughout the Srimad Bhagavatam. So here the Srila Jiva Goswami explains that that this is where they are extensively covered in which canto. So Saga is covered in the 2nd and 3rd canto, although it's also mentioned in the 1st canto. Visharga is extensively covered in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th canto. Secondary creation, the creation by Lord Brahma. The Stanam, is the universal situation, is in the 3rd, 7th, and 8th. Poshanam is in all the cantos, the protection of the devotees, the surrendered devotees by the Lord. The Manvantaras are explained in the 8th, the 4th, and the 9th, and their families. And Ishanokata is in the 4th, about the Lord's incarnations, and in the 9th canto. Narodha in the 11th and 12th, also it's described in the 5th canto, the different annihilations, maybe even the 5th canto too. But Jiva Goswami says the 11th and 12th. And Uti, the creative impetus, is in the 3rd and the 11th. This is Jiva Goswami's analysis. So now in the next verses, 3 through 7, Srila Sukadeva Goswami are going to one by one say something about each of these 10 topics. So first, in the third verse, it's Sarga and Visarga. The elementary creations of 16 items of matter, namely the 5 elements, fire, water, land, air, and sky, sound, form, taste, smell, touch, and the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, and mind, the sense objects and the subtle senses, is known as Sarga, whereas the subsequent resultant interactions of the modes of material nature is called Visarga. Prabhupada explains something very important in his purport. He explains that unless one has reference to the Vedic literatures, one will mistake the secondary creation or the Visarga creation as everything. In other words, one won't be able to trace the creation past matter, and one will see that matter is the source of creation, and one won't be able to trace it to the Lord. And this is just what is going on today with the material scientists, because they don't have access to the literatures. When they look at creation, they only trace it back to other parts of the Visarga or the material aspects of creation. Even though they can't really trace it back, they'll trace it back to a black hole, but they can't say where that comes from. So Prabhupada explains in the purport. As mentioned in the previous verse, Srutena, or with reference to the Vedic conclusions, the creation is made possible from the Supreme Personality of Godhead directly by manifestation of his particular energies. Without such a Vedic reference, the creation appears to be a product of material nature. There's a term that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur used to use about that, like them trying to get milk from the nipples of a goat. There's no milk there. And similarly, matter cannot create anything. Even though it may appear to be doing so, it cannot. This conclusion comes from a poor fund of knowledge, if one thinks that the creation comes from material nature. From Vedic reference, it is concluded that the origin of all energies, namely the internal, external, and marginal, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And as explained hereinbefore, the illusory conclusion is that creation is made by the inert material nature. The Vedic conclusion is transcendental light, whereas the non-Vedic conclusion is material darkness. The internal potency of the Supreme Lord is identical with the Supreme Lord, and the external potency is enlivened in contact with the internal potency. The parts and parcels of the internal potency, which react in contact with the external potency, are called the marginal potency, or the living entities. Thus, the original creation is directly from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or Param Brahma, and the secondary creation, as a reactionary result of the original creation, original ingredients, is made by Brahma. Thus, the activities of the whole universe are started. So that's Sarga and Visarga. And this is going to be discussed. We're going to hear we've heard some Sarga, Visarga. We've heard a lot of Visarga, especially in the second canto. And we're going to hear more Sarga and Visarga and Sarga and Visarga and Sarga and Visarga in the third canto. And then some Visarga in the fourth canto. Because especially in the beginning of our quest in self-realization, the earlier cantos, the first thing we have to understand is how great God is, how powerful He is. Because unless we understand that, there is no impetus to take shelter of Him consciously. Asraya. So in the next verse, in text 4, Stitira Stanam, which is the same, and poshanam, protection, uttaya, the creative impetus, and manvantara, they're described. Uttaya is defined here, is karma vasana, which means the impetus, the desires for fruitive work. These are the material tendencies that exist in the consciousness. This comes from our karma. This karma vasana means when the tendency, the material tendency starts to manifest just before the activity. It's the tendency still. That's called karma vasana. So the right situation for the living entity, this is a sthiti, is to obey the laws of the Lord and thus be in perfect peace of mind under the protection of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Manus and their laws are meant to give right direction in life. The impetus for activity is the desire for fruitive work. There's this word sthiti, or sthanam. Sthiti means the right situation here. Now, there's a phrase that's used in the Sanskrit, sthiti vaikuntha vijaya. Why is sthiti means the situation? Now, how is this? What is the meaning of this? Sthiti indicates the supreme glory of the Lord shown by His maintaining all created beings in their respective positions under His laws. So that's what actually maintains everyone. So therefore it goes sthiti, it goes to this each manvatar. And this Prabhupada says in the purport, the desire to go back to Godhead and functions performed in that direction form the right path of work. When such a regulative path is accepted, the Lord gives all protection to the devotees by His causeless mercy, while the devotees risk their own activities to bind themselves, while the non-devotees risk their own activities to bind themselves in the chain of fruitive reaction. The word sadharma is significant in this connection. So the karma vasana, or the uttaya, is the opposite of this, of the right situation for the living entity, because one leads to binding in the material world and the other leads to poshanam, or the protection of the Lord. Saddharma, or duty performed for going back to Godhead and thus becoming His unalloyed devotee, is the only pious activity. And others may pretend to be pious, but actually they are not. It is for this reason only that the Lord advises in the Bhagavad Gita that one give up all so-called religious activities and completely engage in the devotional service of the Lord to become free from all anxieties due to the dangerous life of material existence. To work situated in Saddharma is the right direction of life. One's aim of life should be to go back to home, back to Godhead, and not to be subject to repeated birth and death in the material world by getting good or bad bodies for temporary existence. Herein lies the intelligence of human life, and one should desire the activities of life in that way. And next is the Avataranucharita. The science of God describes the incarnations of the personality of Godhead and His different activities together with the activities of His great devotees, like Lord Nrsingadev and Prahlad and Dhruva Maharaj and Prishnagarbha. So many incarnations of the Lord and the different devotees that they interact with. That's Ishanukata. Then in text 6, Narodha and Mukti. The merging of the living entity, along with his conditional living tendency, with the mystic lying down of the Maha-Visnu, is called the winding up of the cosmic manifestation, when all the material creation again enters within the Lord. Liberation is the permanent, mukti is the permanent situation of the form of the living entity, What is the actual self, the form of who am I really? Am I this? Am I this? Am I this? Am I this? What is the real me? Who is the real me? To understand that and live in that consciousness is the situation called mukti. So it's the permanent situation, the non-changeable permanent situation of the form of the living entity after he gives up the changeable gross and subtle material bodies. All the coverings are gone. Who is the living entity? That is mukti, that situation. Prabhupada explains in the purport. The material conditional bodies develop out of the living entity's forgetfulness of their relationship with God. And during the course of the cosmic manifestation, the conditioned souls are given a chance to revive their original status of life with the help of the revealed scriptures, so mercifully compiled by the Lord in His different incarnations. Reading or hearing of such transcendental literatures helps one become liberated, even in the conditional stage of material existence. All the Vedic literatures aim at devotional service to the personality of Godhead, and as soon as one is fixed upon this point, he at once becomes liberated from conditional life. And in the next verse, after these 9 have just been described, now the 10th is described. The Supreme One, who is celebrated as the Supreme Being, or the Supreme Soul, is the Supreme Source of the cosmic manifestation, as well as its reservoir and its winding up. Reservoir meaning its source and its winding up. Where, when the cosmic manifestation is annihilated, where does it go? Does it just cease to exist? No, it goes within the Lord. Thus He is this, as the source and the ultimate resting place, is the supreme fountainhead, the absolute truth. Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport. Synonyms for the supreme source of all energies, as explained in the very beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam, Janmad yasyataha vadanti tattvavidas tattvam yajganamadhyam brahmeti paramatmiti bhagavaniti sabhyate, called Brahman, Parabrahman, Paramatma or Bhagavan. The word iti, used here in this verse, completes the synonyms and indicates Bhagavan. This will be further explained in the later verses. But this Bhagavan ultimately means Lord Krishna, because the Srimad Bhagavatam has already accepted the Supreme Personality of Godhead as Krishna. Krishna stu Bhagavan Sayam. The original source of all energies, or the summum bonum, is the absolute truth, which is called Param Brahma. And Bhagavan is the last word of the absolute truth, meaning the highest understanding. But even with the synonyms for Bhagavan, such as Narayan, Vishnu and Purusha, the last word is Krishna, as confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, Aham savasya prabhavo matak savam prabhatate. Beside that, the Srimad Bhagavatam is the representation of Lord Krishna as a sound incarnation of the Lord. Krishna, Krishne Sadam Ubhagate, Dharma Jnanadevi Saha, Kalo Nasta Dishamesha, Puranarko Danoditaha. Thus, by general conclusion, Lord Krishna is the ultimate source of all energies. And the word Krishna means that. And to explain Krishna, or the science of Krishna, the Srimad Bhagavatam has been prepared. In the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, this truth is indicated in the questions and answers by Sukadeva Gosvami and great sages like Shonaka. And in the first and second chapters of the canto, this is explained. In the third chapter, the subject matter, this subject is more explicit. And in the fourth chapter, even more explicit. In the second canto, the absolute truth as the personality of Godhead is further emphasized. And the indication is the Supreme, is Lord Krishna, is the Supreme Lord Krishna. The summary of Srimad Bhagavatam in 4 verses, as we have already discussed, is succinct, very clear. This Supreme Personality of Godhead, in the ultimate issue, is confirmed by Brahma in his Brahma Samhita as Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchidananda Vigraha. So it is concluded in the 3rd canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. The complete subject matter is elaborately explained in the 10th and the 11th cantos of the Srimad Bhagavatam. In the matter of the changes of the Manus or Manvantaras, such as the Swayambhuva Manvantara and the Chakshusha Manvantara, as they are described in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th cantos of Srimad Bhagavatam. So at every point, the conclusion is going to be that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead from so many different points of view. Lord Krishna is indicated in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th cantos of Srimad Bhagavatam. Lord Krishna is indicated. In the 8th canto, the Vaivasvata Manvantara explains the same subject indirectly. And in the 9th canto, the same purport is there. In the 12th canto, the same is further explained, specifically regarding the different incarnations of the Lord. Thus it is concluded by studying the complete Srimad Bhagavatam that Lord Sri Krishna is the ultimate summum bonum, or the ultimate source of all energies. And according to the grades of worshippers, the indications of the nomenclature may be differently explained as Narayan, Brahma, Paramatma, etc. So, this 10th chapter of the 2nd canto is going to tell us very clearly, as it has been doing so far, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Krishna is the source of the creation, both the creation of the material elements and the subsequent creation. And He's the source, He's the resting place of the annihilation. And that the laws of Shastra and the teachings of the avatars, they're all meant to bring us to the point of understanding Krishna. And it is Krishna who protects all His devotees. And we should not get entangled in the karma vasana, the utaya, the tendency to engage in fruitive activities, because that binds us in birth and death, body after body. Rather, we should get liberation, mukti from that, from all this creation, sarga, visarga, naroda. We should get liberation, mukti from that, and ultimately the liberation entails the soul taking shelter. Ultimately, the highest shelter and liberation for the soul is when he takes shelter of Sri Krishna as his servant in Goloka Vrindavan. This is the ultimate for the soul, and this is what we're being told again and again in every, directly and indirectly, in every canto, in every chapter, every verse of the Bhagavatam is only leading to this. To Goloka Vrindavan. This is where it's being pointed only again and again. Now, in the 8th and 9th verse, the same point is being made about the Ashraya, but from a different point of view. It's a little technical. So I'm going to read the 8th and 9th together and read some of the purport. And then we'll stop. Before we read the 8th verse, I'll say that Srila Swami Charan, he says that this verse, the 8th verse, shows the true character of the Ashraya by dividing who we are into subdivisions. Okay. Translation. The individual person possessing different instruments of senses is called the Adhyatmic person. So the soul who is conditioned to think that he's the body, but his subtle conditioning, not the gross body, but the holding of the senses in a subtle way, that person who identifies through the subtle body is called the Adhyatmic person. And the Adhyatmic miseries that we hear that term. There's two terms, the Adhyatmic, Adhibautic, Adhidaivik. There's two terms connected to them. There's Adhyatmic Purusa and Adhyatmic Klesha. Klesha means distress. Now this is talking about the Adhyatmic Purusa, the Adhidaivik Purusa, the Adhidaivik person, and the Adhibautika person. This is a little technical. So the Adhyatmic is the jiva soul who's conditioned, and his identification with his conditioned nature, something like that. Then, so the individual person possessing different instruments of senses, this is referring to the subtle senses, is called the Adhyatmic person. And the individual controlling deity of the senses is called the Adhidaivika person. So the demigods, they control the senses. So the living entity controls the senses from the inside, so to speak, and the demigods control the senses from the outside, and they are called the Adhidaivika person, Adhidaivika Purusha. And the individual controlling deity and the embodiment seen on the eyeballs is called the Adhibautika person. The embodiment seen on the eyeballs just means the gross physical body. When you look at me, what's seen in your eyes, that's another person. The gross body. So these are all upadhis, or designations of the living entity. There's the subtle senses, there are the gross senses, which is this body, and then there are the demigods that control the senses. These are all different senses of identity that we have. And they are all interdependent. That's the point that Srila Sukadeva Goswami wants to make here. They are all independent on each other. Without the gross body, the subtle senses, we don't think in terms of subtle senses. But if you close your eyes and you think about someone cooking in the kitchen or some mahaprasadam, and if you think about what it looks like and what it smells like, you can practically smell and taste these things. But not through the gross senses, but through the subtle senses. So actually there are subtle senses that exist, and they come and sit. They sit in the gross body. And the Bhagavad Gita explains this when it says adishtayam manastayam vishya upasevate, because it's the senses. Based on these senses, we get a gross body. Sparshanam chakshushacha, rasanam granam evacha. So when the living entity goes with his subtle body, when he leaves this body, he takes with him the subtle eyes, subtle nose, subtle hearing. And based on that, we get a gross body. So this is all taken with us. So this is a very important point when we try to understand transmigration. According to the particular type of subtle senses that we develop, according to our activities in this world, and according to our desires in this world, that develops a certain sense of subtle senses in the mind, and according to that, we're going to get a gross body. Next body. So if we develop a tongue that really likes blood, we might end up either a mosquito or a tiger. Because we've developed that sense that has that desire in it. Like that. So these are all interdependent. Meaning that without the gross body, the adibodhika, the subtle body has no ability to work. And without the adidaivika purusha, without the demigods, the subtle body nor the gross body can work. So these are all interdependent. That means they depend on each other. But the Ashraya, or the Lord, is the only one who is independent. We are dependent. Even all these different forms of ourselves, all these different all these different aspects of ourselves as individual. The adidaivika aspect, the adibodhika aspect. When we look in the mirror, we think this is us. So that's one aspect. And the feeling that we have of this is me. Even if we're not looking in the mirror, we have a feeling of this is me. That is the adi-atmika person. And although we don't think about the adidaivika persons, we're completely dependent upon the demigods. So we're not individual. We are not the Ashraya. That's the point that's going to be made. Even because the impersonalists will say that the jiva is the Ashraya, is the supreme. So here, Sukadeva is making the point that the jiva is not the supreme, because the supreme is defined as the one who is independent, who everyone else is depending upon. And therefore the word used in this verse, in the 9th verse, will be this svashraya asraya. And that means the shelter of the shelter. That means the one who is the only one who is dependent. All those, just like in this world, a husband may give shelter to the wife. And the wife may give shelter to the children. And the children may give shelter to the cat. And the cat may give shelter to his fleas. And the fleas may give shelter to a parasite. So everyone is both being sheltered and is a shelter for another. Just like one time some devotee asked Prabhupada, if I eat prasadam, do all the microorganisms in my body take prasadam and get benefited? And Prabhupada replied, oh, you are so kind that you eat prasadam for the benefit of others. He was joking. Because generally we think mostly of ourselves when we eat prasadam. But yes, every living entity is a shelter for others. But every living entity is also being sheltered by others. So where does that sheltering stop? That sheltering stops at Krishna, who gives shelter. He is the Ashraya, the shelter of all living entities, but he himself has no shelter. He is the Asraya Asraya. He is the shelter of all others, the shelter of all other shelters, but he himself has no shelter. He is the supreme shelter, the ultimate shelter. So the jiva cannot be the ultimate shelter. Why? Because he is dependent. He has interdependent relationships. So therefore in the 9th verse it explains, all three of the above mentioned stages of different living entities are interdependent. In the absence of one, another is not understood. Unless the demigods help us, we cannot see. Unless we have the body, we cannot see. Unless we have the subtle senses and the jiva as the adhyatmika person, we cannot see. So everyone is interdependent. But the Supreme Being who sees every one of them as the shelter of the shelter is independent of all, and therefore he is the supreme shelter. He is the actual Ashraya. So again, Sukadeva is establishing who the Ashraya is, and it's Krishna. I'll just read a little of the purport, and then I'll read one verse that makes an additional point to this. So Prabhupada explains what the purpose of this is in the end of the purport. He says, The individual living entity, the jiva, is always dependent on the Supersoul, the Paramatma. So that's the ultimate dependence. Because the individual soul forgets his spiritual identity, whereas the Supersoul, the Paramatma, does not forget his transcendental position. In the Bhagavad Gita, these separate positions of the Jivatma and the Paramatma are specifically mentioned. In the 4th chapter, Arjuna, the Jiva soul, is represented as forgetful of his many, many previous births. So Prabhupada here is explaining how the Jiva can never be the Paramatma, either in the conditioned stage or the unconditioned stage. Because the Mayavadis will say that yes, the Ashraya is the Jiva, but no, either in the conditioned stage or the unconditioned stage, the Jiva can never be the Ashraya because he's always dependent. In the conditioned stage, he's dependent on the Adidaivika person and the Adibhotika person, and Prabhupada's explaining more. We are always dependent. The Lord even remembers when he taught the Bhagavad Gita to the sun god some billions of years before. The Lord can remember such millions and billions of years, as stated in the Bhagavad Gita. Vedaham samatityani vartamanani charjana bhavishyani chabutani mam tu veda nakaschana. The Lord, in his eternal blissful body of knowledge, is fully aware of what happened in the past, that which is going on at the present, and also what will happen in the future. But in spite of his being the shelter of both the Paramatma and Brahman, persons with a poor fund of knowledge are unable to understand him as he is. The propaganda of the identity of the cosmic consciousness with the consciousness of the individual living entity is completely misleading, because even such a person or individual soul as Arjuna cannot remember his past deeds, although he is always with the Lord. So that means he's liberated. He's liberated, but yet still he can't remember the past. This is from the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, or rather 2nd. And what can the tiny ordinary man, falsely claiming to be one with the cosmic consciousness, know about his past, present, and future? And Jiva Goswami quotes one verse from the 6th canto that shows that even in the fully liberated stage, the living entity is not only not one with Krishna, but he can't understand Krishna. So if he can't understand Krishna, how is he the Supreme? And how is he the shelter, the Ashraya? So from the 6th canto, 4th chapter, 25th verse. Deho savo cha manavo bhutamatram atmanam manyam chave vidu param yat sarvam pumam veda gunam statorgya na veda savagyam anantanamide. Because they are only matter, the body, the life airs, the external and internal senses, the 5 gross elements, and the subtle sense objects, form, taste, smell, sound, and touch, they cannot know their own nature, the nature of the other senses, or the nature of their controllers. But the living being, because of his spiritual nature, can know his body, the life airs, the senses, the elements, and the sense objects. And he can also know the 3 qualities that form their roots. So the senses can't know themselves. They are not superior. They're external. They have no consciousness. But the living entity can know his senses. He can know his life airs. He can know even if he's a jnani. He can know even the modes of material nature, passion, goodness, and ignorance. He can get to the root. He can know, be conscious of all these things. Nevertheless, although the living entity, the living being is completely aware of them, he is unable to see the Supreme Being, who is omniscient and unlimited. I therefore offer my respectful obeisances unto the Lord. The living being, Prabhupada explains in the Purport, even if advanced, cannot understand the Supreme Being, the Personality of Godhead. For he, the Lord, is Ananta, unlimited in all 6 opulences. So he, the Lord, is the Ashraya, the shelter. And we should take shelter of him. Okay, thank you very much. Questions or comments? Wow.
One is on these 10 topics.
Yeah.
The 9 topics preceding the 10th topic.
Yes.
Are they, can one see Krishna directly and indirectly in each of these?
Yeah, of course.
In the beginning, the creation, even subcreation.
Because the creation comes from Krishna. The subcreation comes from Krishna. The conditioning of the living entity comes from Krishna ultimately. Krishna is the cause of all causes.
Some of them seem more indirect.
Yeah, indirectly. But if you follow the indirectly long enough, you get to Krishna directly.
My other question is that you mentioned that every living entity is receiving shelter and giving shelter. But the Vedic aphorism I often remember is Jiva Jiva Si Jivanam, which every living entity is food for another. So what's the difference?
Well, we don't give shelter to all living entities, but we're still giving shelter to some living entities. Even the tiger who is eating another living entity, or the human, still he's giving shelter to other living entities. So he's a shelter-giving entity and a living entity who takes shelter. Both.
But why is it that in the Vedas that eating aspect is more prominent? It's in that verse.
And why is that verse? It's, you know where that verse is from? It's from the 13th chapter of the first canto. And he's describing, Vidura is describing how if you're afraid, he's telling Yudhisthira, if you're afraid that Dhritarashtra is going to be eaten, because Dhritarashtra has gone all alone, unprotected. If you're afraid that he's going to be eaten by some living entities, you should understand that this is the natural law. So don't be afraid of the natural law, because one living entity is food for another. So everything has to be understood in a specific context. Otherwise we will only see contradictions. But if one understands the siddhanta of the entirety, then one will understand the frame of reference that things are spoken in, and then one won't see contradictions, but one will see continuity. Yeah.
Do the other Puranas have the same sort of balance of things as the Bhagavad Purana, or do they?
The Maha-Puranas, the big ones?
The other ones, on the other 9 topics?
There are certain no. The Bhagavad Purana emphasizes the Ashraya, the Krishna. It's a completely transcendental Purana. But all Puranas have to have certain characteristics, otherwise they're not accepted as Puranas. I don't know. Maybe there's 18 major Mahapuranas. Is that what it is? But those two are in different modes of material nature. They're in the Sattvika, Tamasika, and Rajasika. They have to have mention of the different characteristics. There's additional characteristics other than these 10.
But just like it explains here that according to the grades of worship, the indications and the nomenclature may be differently explained as Narayana, Brahma, and Paramatma. So do they trace on the pastimes?
Trace on it?
Do they have a large section in the pastimes of
Krishna? Every Purana? No.
In all the Puranas?
I know that the other Puranas indicate others, the Rajasika Puranas, imitate, like Lord Brahma as the Supreme. Lord Siva. There are other characteristics. Any other? Yeah.
I was wondering, you were talking about eating before, and I wonder if we can honor prasada with our subtle senses.
Why would you want to do that?
If you can't actually eat it, can we honor it?
Well, Prabhupada actually did that. In his last days, he couldn't physically eat. So he asked that the prasadam that was offered to him be brought to him so he could see what he was being offered. He wanted to see the plates. If we can't eat a lot, we can just, usually the devotees will at least honor the smallest amount, just to honor it. There's that story that's of the South Indian Brahmin who cooked sweet rice just in his mind, and he offered it to Krishna. But he physically, when he touched the pot in his mind, he physically got a burn in his body, his gross body. So these things are very wonderful for offering and honoring. Yeah, one seems. But you might not get as healthy, get the strength physically. Okay? Alrighty then. Srimad Bhagavatam.